started cutting down the sheet into more manageable sizes, and then started ripping it down into strips. The strips measure 1 1/8 inches wide, which is actually the thickness of the table. So I started to glue up here, and I used a straight piece of wood to glue up against to make sure everything else was as square as possible, since all the pieces after will be referenced off these two first pieces. When I got to the edges of the table, I tried to avoid using brad nails and instead used these Rockler bandy clamps, so when I go to cut the table to size I wouldn't hit the brad nails, which I later did anyways. Here I'm filling up the gaps with wood filler, and there were plenty of gaps to be filled. I used this little straight cutting jig I built a while back to cut the edges. I took multiple passes with the circular saw to prevent binding and tear out. To round over the edges of the table, I used a 1/4 inch roundover bit, which I didn't have, so a quick trip to Rockler and I picked up one of these. Again, I took many passes to prevent tear out. I got a little tear out in a couple places, but a little bit of glue and the bandy clamp and everything was fixed. The table needed tons of sanding, so I picked up one of these Ryobi belt sanders and spent a whole afternoon sanding this thing down flat. With the top pretty much done, I designed the legs to have a 20-degree angle and a height of about 16 inches. I drew up a template on some MDF and cut it out on the bandsaw. The leg is comprised of two pieces, and here I am tracing the inner piece of the leg and figuring out how I want to lay out the plywood pattern. I glued up the pieces for the leg at an angle to give it an angular pattern. Then I traced the template onto the legs. To cut out the legs, I made this tapering jig. To get the angles on the feet, I just cut slowly and slowly snuck up on the line. To attach the two pieces of the legs, I used this doweling jig from Rockware. I'll have a link to all the stuff I used in the description below. I also cut out this angle piece of wood to help clamp the two pieces together. Like the tabletop, I used the 1/4 inch roundover bit to round over the edges. For the inside edges, I used a 3/8 inch roundover to give it a different look and angle. Everything was then sanded smooth, working from 80 grit all the way up to 220 grit. To attach the legs to the top, I used a Forstner bit to draw a recess, then drilled all the way through for bolts to slide into. I used bolts and threaded inserts, that way I can attach and detach the legs without worrying about stripping the wood. The threaded inserts were screwed in and I added some epoxy for extra strength, which I forgot to film.
I finished off the table with 2 coats of satin wipe-on poly.